Ben, thank you. A round of applause.
Okay. Professional sound guys, please auto-tune my voice. Well, thanks a lot again for last night. I really enjoyed the conversation and the time together and the fellowship. And I am really grateful to be here on the 50th anniversary as you think about, again, what you're grateful for in the past and as you envision moving forward. I think my own experience being a fifth generation provides some perspective and actually some distance from that first, second generation and I think, I think the differences between the generations actually narrow over time. As we're, mostly raised in America, the generation gap lessens, but we also, like my son and I, we want to look back to our Asian background. We want to see what are the strengths, what our heritages are, and we want to reclaim it. And so I want to use today time to, again, for me to reclaim, for me, my Asianness. And before the pandemic, I was thinking about writing this book about the gifts of the Asian American church. A lot of Asians are going to multi-ethnic churches now, but churches don't know what to do with all these Asians. And they just assume they're like white people, and they just sort of blend into the mass. And it's as if Asians have nothing to offer, that they're not any different. And so again, we get invisibilized, omitted, and we go into that white-black divide. But really, they're losing out if they're not using and celebrating the gifts of Asians in their midst. And even as a fifth generation, I still retain some tacit Asian DNA, not just physically and genetically, but culturally, and I want to talk about that today. So if we could go to the next slide, please. Actually, I want to move so I can look at the screen. Revelations 21 talks about how the kings of the earth will bring their splendor to the city of God, and that we all have their splendor, our particular gifts. And the question then is, what does the Korean American church have to offer as we go to heaven, as we bring our gifts to the table? And unless we're aware of these gifts, unless we actually cultivate them, then we'll just come empty-handed to the church, right? And that's sort of embarrassing, especially if you're Asian, to go to someone's house and not bring fruit or something. So again, I want to propose some gifts that I've seen in the Asian American church over the years. Okay, next slide. So like last night, I talked about how our gifts can be paradoxically found in our weaknesses, right? Because in our weaknesses, that's where we see God's grace, God's power, God's strength. And so it's both and. Our weaknesses are both our weaknesses. They're painful. They need to be redeemed, but they're also our strength. They're something we can cultivate and use. And so, again, our foreigner status is painful. We're getting attacked for it because of racism, but it's also God's gift to us to maintain a distance from this world, to be exiles into this world. If you're a eunuch, if you feel impotent, if you feel emasculated in the society, if you feel disrespected, that could be a gift. And in the same way, I want to talk about our weak areas. And again, one of my weaknesses, even as a fifth generation, I'm actually really influenced by being more from a shame honor society than from a guilt individualistic society that a lot of Westerners have. And so let me talk about our shame orientation. Again, it's both and. You want to keep some of shame and honor. Explicitly, that's wrong, that's bad, it's embarrassing. But shame, the dangerous side of shame is that be really debilitating, really painful. Again, fifth generation, still this shame mechanism really operates within my family, and I'll tell you one story. As I mentioned yesterday, my father is he was pretty fun-loving, and that's why, again, Jeung dads are great with kids, but at sometimes, for certain issues, he could be really stern and demanding. And so for my dad, he wanted us to be really punctual because he wanted to be respected. Again, because of that shame honor thing, he wants respect more than anything. And to be respected means you honor his time. And if you waste his time, he's an accountant, so it's inefficient. And so I had this aunt coming from out of town, and we were going to take her out to dinner. And so again, it's the combination of time and punctuality and food and taking care of family. And I show up late, and this was when I was in high school, and I just sort of come sauntering in, being, non-frontal cortex, no executive function kid. And so I just come in late, and I thought nothing of it, it's no big deal. But he just yelled at me in public, in front of everybody, in front of the whole restaurant, right? And he just again, he did one of his explosive bursts of anger. And I was just shocked, right? Because again, it's traumatizing. And so first you go into flight or fight mode, but I was in frozen mode. And I was just really, really embarrassed, right? Because I got yelled at in public. But when I thought about it, I felt really shamed. And I actually cried. I actually hid my face in my jacket, and throughout the dinner, I just was so embarrassed and so ashamed. And I think that's actually a valid response. Because I really loved my dad, and I knew I was wrong, that I should be on time, that I should respect my aunt who's coming out of town. And because I love my dad, I really wanted his approval. And so I just cried. This is really, it's even more embarrassing being a teenage male and crying in public. And so so that's why it's so memorable for me, because I feel so stupid. But it actually worked in one way, in the sense that my dad really taught me, I'm really punctual now, right? I'm really on time. I really seek to respect people. And I noticed that most of you here got here at 8:57. Thank you very much, but some of you were. But I'm also, again, really traumatized. I'm really stressed out. If I'm going to be late, then I get really antsy and I get really angry and frustrated. So the shame, it works that it makes me timely, but the shame also sort of hurts me, right? Because I'm always stressed. And now I'm always nagging my wife and kids, come on, church starts now. You gotta, I give them 10-minute warnings, 5-minute warnings. And that's how shame operates, right? We internalize that shame, and sometimes it could be really powerful, that we don't want to be shameless, but it could also be really debilitating. And these are some of the ways that it's really painful when you come from a shame-based society. Next slide. So shame, like you all often know, I like the Chinese character, if you see the one on the right. You see the roof, right? So the character is, you see you got people under a roof and you have their open mouths. So the notion of shame is that people are sitting around talking about you, right? Because you talk about other people and you talk about, oh yeah, she got into Harvard, she got straight A's, and my kid is a stupid, lazy, screen-looking. And so kids know that our parents and aunts and uncles are always talking about us. And they figure if my parents are talking about them, then other parents are also talking about me, right? So we're all very aware that people are talking about us. That's the whole notion of shame and face. And if you lose face, for a lot of Asians, losing face and shame is worse than guilt. So there's a difference, right? So I ask my students, what's worse? You get caught cheating on a test. Is it worse being guilty because you did something wrong, you cheated, you only cheated yourself? Or it's worse to be shamed and have your parents angry at you? And unanimously, so I teach Asians, they all said, oh, having our parents mad at us, that's way worse. The shame is much more worse than the guilt. And so because it leads to this other awareness, your identity then, your sense of self, really comes from how others perceive you and how much respect you get, right? That's how shame operates. You feel good about yourself if others see you as being respectful, worthy, honored. And then you feel bad about yourself if others see you and look down on you, right, disrespect you. And of course, Asians always feel bad about ourselves because there's always that cousin who did go to Harvard and, plays piano. And yeah, that's my wife. Okay, so I'm always feeling bad about my son always feels bad about himself too, because we can never compare. So the problem with shame, because it operates in our families, and then by extension, it operates in the church, because the church is our extended family, right? So you get how shame operates in the church as well. And so in church, just like in their family, we're always trying to maintain our face. We're always trying to maintain our reputation. And that could be good because then you have, propriety. But then we become more concerned about looking good rather than being good in of itself for God, right? It's sort of like what we sang about how we always want to sing and worship, but we really want a real heart. And because we're shame-based, we just care about how we appear more than how we really are on the inside. Another danger of shame is that we don't want to appear weak. We often say, I don't want to trouble you, right? You don't want to need anybody. And so you mask your weaknesses, you mask the things that make you look helpless. You want to mask needing others. And so then you avoid help seeking. And for me, because we're avoiding losing face and we're avoiding seeking help, I wonder how Asians really then receive God's grace. Because if we don't want to trouble others, do we not want to trouble God? If we always are trying to earn our wealth, earn our status, are we always trying to earn our approval from God, right? And that's the typical Asian issue. We don't know how to receive grace because we're always trying to merit God's approval. We're always trying to earn it. And we always praise the people who work the hardest. Oh, thank you guys in the back for coming, working hard. But do we praise the people who just receive grace, right? Do we praise the sinners who are saying, I'm so needy? So I know Asians shame-based culture, and for the newer generations, they're also really shame-based. Next slide. So because of screens and because of social media, Gen Z are also very shame-based. American society is becoming more Asian in that younger people are also concerned about how they self-present, right? Because they're on screens all the time and they see people having fun all the time, people eating all the time, people looking really good and dancing on TikTok, and I can't dance, and so I suck, So there's this musical called Dear Evan Hansen. It's now a movie, and the whole plot about this high school story is about high schoolers needing to be seen and heard. So that's your major identity preoccupation is, do I have a voice? Am I different? Am I unique? Am I ever heard? And so again, it's a very appearance-based shame orientation. So we're all dealing with this. And so again, the younger generations can learn from the older generations if the older generations can treat shame healthfully. Okay, next slide. So fortunately for us, scriptures, Testament times, they also come from that shame-based culture, right? A shame honor society. And I think the parable of this prodigal son, we see the dynamics of shame at work. You know that the younger son is shameless because he acts rebelliously. He wants his father dead and he acts independently. He doesn't care what his father thinks and he goes off, right? So he's not even operating out of shame. But when he hits rock bottom, squanders everything, next slide, he comes back and says, I'm no longer worthy, right? That's not that shame, worth dynamic. It's not that he, in of himself, he's not worthy in the eyes of his father, right? So when he was shameless, he only thought about himself as an individual. When he goes back to being unworthy, he sees himself in a relationship to the Father, right? So your identity goes from being individualistic to being relational. And in that relational dynamic, he's not worthy because that worth is conferred by the Father. It's both and. Our worth is both We are created in God's image. We're imago Dei, so innately we are worthy as individuals. But our worth is also conferred by God. God sees us. And so his worth is based on his interconnected with the Father, and so he recognizes he's unworthy. The elder son also is dominated by shame. Next slide. That shame dynamic makes him compare himself with his younger brother and how he's seen and treated by, as compared to how his younger brother is seen and heard, right? And because he's been working really hard trying to gain the approval of the Father, and he doesn't get it, so he becomes bitter and resentful. And so I don't know if you guys ever become bitter and resentful, but if you compare, it's really easy to become jealous and angry and frustrated because you're not getting what you think you deserve. So I think a lot of Asians relate to the sons in the prodigal son, right? In that sometimes we're rebellious and we just want to do our own things. Sometimes we're really bitter that we're not getting the approval that we want. Other times we're always trying to earn something. And the good news, though, is that in this story, the Father both directly and indirectly addresses their shame. And I think, again, this is the gift of being Asian. If we see ourselves in this story, then we could better resonate with it, right? We could better explicate it. We could better share it with others. And so I think from our Asian backgrounds, we can connect to this story. And then also, if we feel the same shame and pain that the sons feel, maybe we understand God's love in better, deeper ways, and then share that with the broader church. So you follow me? The gifts of the Asian American church is not that we're any better, but because of our cultural background, we could relate to God, relate to scriptures in a certain way, and that's God's gift to us, and that's our gift to others. So as you hear what I see God gifting us with, I want you to jot down, what are other gifts that God gives the Korean church, the Asian church, as you think about from our cultural background, from our historic background, from our racial background. But I'll tell you a couple of things that I see how we as Asian Christians can receive this story. Okay, next slide. Now, how many of you have heard of the 5 love languages? So a lot of you, right? This is written by Gary Chapman. This is how European Americans talk about love. That love is expressed and communicated and received in certain ways. And so Gary Chapman wrote this book. It became an international bestseller because these are supposed to be the universal ways we receive and communicate love. And there's 5 universal ways. They're affirmation, touch, gifts, time, and service. And because he's a European American, he says, everybody's like me, it's universal. Everybody experiences love like this. So that's fine. These are great ways to show love. If you're affirming and you're really encouraging, that's great. If you're a gift giver, that's great. But for me, from my Chinese background, I look at these ways of loving and think, wow, we're sort of dysfunctional. My parents never told me, I love you, you're such a good kid. They always said, why'd you get an A-, right? It's like, they never hugged me, right? If anything, they spank kids and, their language of love is discipline. So the problem with this, is Christianity, European American Christianity is cited as universal, then that becomes colonizing, and we who are non-white feel bad about ourselves, right? We feel like, we become resentful. It's like, how come I get love like this and we have to go through years of therapy? But in the story, I think there are other love languages that the Father exhibits that are Asian love languages. So let me highlight the way the Father loves in the prodigal son story that we as Asians could get, and we could add to these ways of love language. The first is loyal love, Hesed. The Father saw him when he was away off. So this loyalty of the Father is that even though he thought his son was dead, he kept on looking for him, right? He was always on the watch for his son to come back. He was that loyal. Even though he thought he was dead, he still hoped that he would come, so that when he did see him, he immediately saw him. And when he saw him, he was filled with compassion, and he ran to his son. So they said, he had to lift up his skirt. That's shameless for Asian fathers. But still, he acted shamelessly because he was so loyal to his son. And I love this because I like the stories of reunions, of homecomings, of fathers hugging their kids. Next slide. And I think my aunts and my mom really demonstrate this loyalty that's really lost today, right? Especially after the pandemic, people are quitting their jobs, are no longer loyal. No, Kyrie Irving doesn't want to play for the Nets, even though he gets, that's Isaiah Thomas, Celtics aren't loyal to him. But my mom, when my dad had a stroke, she went to the hospital every day, right? And just stayed with him. My uncle also had a stroke. This is my uncle. And eventually he beat himself and he couldn't communicate anymore. And yet my aunt stayed with him and fed him regularly. When he came out of the hospital she didn't send him to a nursing home, even though it would have been more practical, even though it was easier. She fed him every day. She bathed him every day. And then she changed his diapers every day. She woke up every night, twice a night, to roll him over so he doesn't get bed sores. My aunt did this for 3 years. She never went on vacation. She didn't take a break because she was concerned about taking care of my uncle. That's loyal love. My uncle couldn't reciprocate that love. He couldn't touch her back. He couldn't affirm her because he couldn't talk. He couldn't give her gifts. So even though that love was unrequited, my aunt was still loyal to my uncle. That's a model for me of God's love to us. I think that's a model of how the first generation people are to the church, how committed they are to the church, their loyalty to the group, not just themselves. I think that loyalty is really a value that's lost in America that we as Asians need to hold on to, need to reclaim, and need to receive from God that he's been so loyal to us. We can then be loyal to others. The second language, next slide, is blessing and honor. And this is actually the opposite of being shamed and losing face. In the passage, the Father gave to the Son and blesses him, right? He gave him a robe, just like Joseph got a many-colored jacket, right? So he was given favor with a robe. He was given a ring for authority, so he could act in the name of the Father. So he got a robe, he got a ring, and then he got sandals, so that sandals indicate family status. The servants went around barefoot, but the family members got to wear sandals in the house, which really isn't Asian, but let that go. So, in the story, the Father blesses and gives gifts of blessing to the Son. And in the same way, God blesses us with favor, with authority, and with family status. So I don't know if you see that blessing as a way of loving, but if you come from a shame-based culture, maybe that's God's gift of salvation to us who feel so shamed. Replace our shame with honor and favor. So I know in a Western sense, we think guilt, we need to be saved from our guilt so we get forgiven. But for Asians, perhaps the good news is that we're saved from our shame, always having to hide from God, always embarrassed about ourselves, always feeling unworthy. And God's good news is that he gives us favor, honor, and respect. So I don't know how you understand blessing, but in America, it's really shallow, right? When people say, oh, I'm blessed, it just means they're happy, right? It's just a sort of like giddy, or it's like getting successful. But in the Asian sense, being blessed, and in the biblical sense, it means actually being seen and having the favor of someone, right? So you see that blessing again and again in the Bible. They were so desired to be seen and to be favored that Jacob actually schemed and stole Esau's blessing, right? Jacob wanted to be seen and to be favored. The Beatitudes are, people are blessed, those who mourn, those who hunger and thirst after righteousness, because they're seen, right, and favored by God. Mary declared in the Magnificat, I'm blessed because I have the Lord's favor. He sees me and he honors me. That's what blessing is. It's replacing that shame of being hidden and being seen with honor and respect. And so, for me, the removal of shame is a real legitimate high form of love. It's what I've been longing for all my life. I think it's the way we, if it's about, it's a relational thing. Removing shame is restoring right relations. Because no longer are people angry at us, no longer are people looking down on us, but right relations are stored where people honor us, respect us, and love us. Next slide. So we talked about Matthew 25. I've been talking to you about Matthew 25. I also like the parable of the talents. And for me, what's really motivating me is to steward what God's given me, and then at the end, hear God say to me, well done, good and faithful servant. For me to be in his holy presence, to come and meet God face to face, to hear those words, that would mean everything to me. And, some people say, so that's sort of wrong. You should feel good about yourself. You shouldn't depend on the favor of others. But I think it's really legitimate to seek the approval of others. And I think it's really legitimate to seek the approval of God. Because I'd rather have God approve of me than even myself approving of me, right? I'd rather have God's esteem than healthy self-esteem. I think about the shame that burned when I was late to my father, and it didn't seem that big of a deal, but I still feel pained. But the good news was there were times when I really did receive my call, when I really did have my father's blessing. My brother told me recently, because of what I've been doing with Stop AAPI Hate, my dad would have said, "That's my boy," when he heard about what I've been doing. And so that approval, again, is meaningful. It's what I want, it's what I long for. And I think wanting our family's approval, wanting our church's approval, wanting God's approval, it could be toxic, it could be obligating, but it's also still valid. So when my son Matthew was born, we gave him a Chinese name. And it's also a Korean name. It's Guanhui Guanhui, right? You could see it. And it means crown of glory. That's because I want Matthew to know that even though we come from a shame-based culture, God takes away his ashes, God takes away his crown of shame, and instead honors him with a crown of glory. For me, that's Asian salvation. For me, that's God's gift to us. For me, that's what we could gift to others. Next slide. Then there's another gift. They keep on coming. There are different ways God loves. This is, for me, one of the most obvious way Asians love each other. It's with food. The father said, let's kill a calf and have a feast, right? So, my grandmother would always say when I came home, have you eaten yet? And I always thought, that's weird, right? Because she knows I just came home from school. And then I realized when I went to China, that's what everybody says. It's a form of greeting. Have you eaten yet? Because that's how they extend love. They are concerned about your physical well-being. And so feeding each other is, again, the Asian ways of love. I don't know if second generation went away to college, but your parents gave you rice cookers and bags of rice or something. And they always come with food, right? Love language is seen in like, what's your comfort food, right? What do you want when you're sick? And it's, oh, I want my mom's soup, right? And so that's love. And that's how God loves us too. Next slide. For me, there's all these ways where I receive God's love. My dad was really concerned about taking care of the family, but his favorite moments were when he was able to provide and have parties. And so here he is pictured at my wedding. He was super pleased, not only because I finally found someone who would marry me, but because he could throw a banquet. My mom loves me. She's really thoughtful, and the way she's thoughtful is she always buys me what she knows are my favorite snacks. And so that's really cool. Even in my middle age, I don't like eating food that's too hard to eat, like crab or oxtail, because it's work to eat. I'm too lazy. That's a third generation thing. You get lazy and you just want to eat things that are easy. And so, so my mom, even though I'm middle aged, she's like 90, she still cracks crab for me and gives me the biggest pieces because I'm her baby. And that's how I know I'm loved. We have foster daughters, right? And when they grew up and they got their first jobs, with their first paychecks, they took us out for dinner, right? They used their first paycheck to honor us. So that's our way to receive love. And so that's also how God loves us. He is our bread of life, always providing for us. And that's why I love communion. I know I'm often weak, needy, and tired, longing for God's feeding. And in that bread, he feeds us, right? He becomes present. And that's how I receive God's love, through communion. And of course, when we get to heaven, God's going to be throwing us a banquet. It'll be like a massive family potluck. And so the food metaphor totally works. It's not really a metaphor. Food is love, and love is food. Next slide. Now here's a real COVID way of loving. It's just presence. The older, am I going long? The elder son complains, and the father says, you are always with me. I am always with you. And he just offers his presence. So again, like my foster daughters, they were foster daughters because they were abandoned. They were, they faced a lot of estrangement. They grew up in Burma and they lost their mom when they were young. And then they had to move out and go to Malaysia because of religious persecution and because of the economic conditions. When they were abroad, their father died. So they were only teenagers, early teenagers, when they were left alone in the world by themselves. And so they came to the US with just their backs, and they said they felt so abandoned, so lost in America, so small. And they just said, we felt small as orphans. Eventually they grew to become really independent, but they never really learned how to become attached and interdependent. And so what I want them to know as their dad, and actually what I want my own son to know, that as their father, I will always be present for them. That if they ever need me, I'll be there. You know that James Taylor song, You Got a Friend? I'm probably in the wrong generation of nobody. But it's like winter, spring, summer, fall, all you have to do is call and I'll come running to see you again. And that's how I feel for my kids. I want to be present for them, always taking care of them. My love is to be for them and to be with them. Next slide. And so for my family, I learned this language of presence. So even though my dad had a small business and was always working a lot, like Korean Americans who are always really busy at work, they always made it a point to say, we're going to be home for dinner, and then they'll go back to work. And my mom would go back to work with my dad. Or they would drag us out all the way to Chinatown just so that we could eat with my dad. Again, it's that combination of love, of food, and presence. And again, we would always go out for Saturday dim sum, Lunar New Year festivals. We always had to be together. So the point of being family is to be together, right? That's the idea of family, being together and present. And you know now, as we come out of COVID, how much people miss the presence of each other while being at church. I hear a lot about how some people aren't coming back. They like the hybrid thing. But really, when people come back together and they actually are in present, face to face with each other, it is God's way of showing love, right? It is. There's something about congregating, of meeting, of seeing each other face to face, of passing the peace in a real physical way. That's love. That's how I think God loves us. So even in my own darkest times, even in my loneliest times, even in the deepest trials, I didn't necessarily feel God's amazing power over this overwhelming sense of peace. But I do know that I've often felt God's presence, and that God journeys with us through the fire, and that's enough. Okay, next slide. And finally, the last one is that I think Asians, especially second generation, intuitively understand sacrifice. The father demonstrated the sacrifice in that he sacrificed his own son. It's sort of like Abraham giving up his Isaac. And so the father in the story had to sacrifice his own son, the prodigal son, and leave him to be dead. And so he too had to sacrifice. Another example of sacrifice is seen in this picture. I love this picture. You see it? What do you see? Two pandas, right? But one's not a real panda, one's a human carrying a baby panda. And the baby panda is an orphan panda. And so the human dresses like a panda so that the panda won't get attached to humans, but eventually will be able to reintegrate into panda society. And so I think the human is really sacrificing, right? Because this is in China, this is in Sichuan, China, this is in one of the 3 furnaces of China. It's really, really hot there, yet this human is putting on a furry stuffed animal costume, walking around like a panda, so that the panda, baby panda, who's an orphan, can grow up like a real panda. I like this picture because it's funny, but also because this is what Jesus did for us. He took on human form, really uncomfortable, I imagine, left a comfortable heaven to come to earth, to be with us, to show us what it's like to be fully human. He sacrificed himself in this way, and we're not as cute as baby orphan pandas. We're like warring, evil, self-obsessed, angry people. Yet Jesus took the form of humanity and sacrificed himself to be with us. Next slide. And of course, those of us with immigrant family, we understand sacrifice because we see our parents sacrificing so much for us. And again, I spoke about it yesterday. They've had to be uprooted and leave home. Nobody wants to be a voluntary immigrant. People are usually involuntary migrants. They became deaf and mute, not understanding fully what's going on in society. Oftentimes, Asians experience downward mobility. They may be educated to be doctors and they have to run, gas stations here. And they have long hours of labor. So I think a lot of us understand sacrifice because we have models in our family. We intuitively get it. Some of us feel so burdened and obligated. But really, for me, a healthy way is like, no, that's love. What greater love that can man have than to sacrifice himself for his friend or for his kids? And so I think we understand Jesus' sacrifice in very tangible ways because we see it in our families. And that's why I think a lot of times Asian Americans really are more faithful, a lot more fervent, a lot more grateful to God. So, to conclude, these are the ways I think God has loved me in this story and God has loved me in my life. There are sort of Asian-specific ways, or I could really receive it as an Asian, that if I weren't Asian, I don't think I wouldn't connect as much. I think I could recognize the shame, the alienation of the younger son, the resentment of the older son, the seeking approval of the older son, the anger of the older son, but I could also then receive the father's gifts so much more. Not only can we as Asians receive these gifts of love, of loyalty, the gifts of blessing, but then because we understand it maybe in deeper ways, we could also share it to the broader church. That's not just for ours to hold on to, but God's gifts to us, again, are our gifts to others. God's blessings to us are so that we can bless others. The final three love languages really are the symbols of the church, right? It's communion, bread and wine, food that represent God's presence. Sacrifice is a cross. We Asians understand the central symbols of Christianity. They're not the 5 love languages of Gary Chapman. They're the love language of Scripture that we understand. So I invite you to receive God's love in these deep, deep ways. I want us to know the extent, the width, and the depth of God's love. And I think because we're Asian, we can understand that love in certain ways that we can share with others. Amen.
That was really enlightening for, I think, all of us here today. We have lunch in like 5 minutes, so maybe we can field like 2 questions. Is that okay? Okay. And then we asked that if you asked a question yesterday to kind of refrain. So if anyone new who hasn't been able to ask a question, if you have a question, to please raise your hand. So just 2 questions before we go to lunch. Oh, sorry, not lunch. Sorry, I mean the pictures, everyday pictures. I mean, sorry. Lunch is at 12. I'm still on Eastern time. It's 12 in Eastern time. So maybe 2 questions, quick questions for Dr. Jeung.
Thanks so much for your lecture. I'm also sorry from Long Island, New York. That's a new concept. By the way, I love our language books, but I like your lecture too. But honestly, as a person who were totally out of Asian community for a while, I can see that those 5 love languages that you said is not necessarily unique in Asian culture. Food is also important in white culture and black culture and Hispanic culture. And guilt and shame is very prevalent in white culture and also Hispanic culture as well. So while I relate to the points that you are making, I wonder how you can claim that those points are uniquely Asian. Because it's prevalent in other ethnicities as well.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm not claiming they're unique. They're universal too. So, there's no claim of uniqueness. There is claim that we have cultural resonance and we could read scriptures in this way with our lenses, from our ethnic backgrounds, from our family backgrounds. We get it, and maybe because we get it better, then we could share it. So they're universal. Everybody loves food. That's why it works. Right? It's in our particularities that we become universal. And so the more we could say, yeah, I really get God's love and sacrifice because my family loved me that way, that's universal. But we share what we can understand in our particularities. The problem is that Western Christianity has been so like, this is universal, this is salvation, it's forgiveness of sin and guilt. The Bible talks about shame 3 times more than guilt. right? So what's good news for Asians? What's good news for everybody coming from a shame-based culture? What's good news for our young people who are on their screens all the time? It's freedom from being captive of the screen. It's freedom from FOMO and comparing yourself. So yeah, it's not unique, but we get it in certain ways that we can share. And so it's our cultural particularity. So I don't want to claim uniqueness, and I don't want to claim universality. I want to claim particularity that others can relate to.
Mr. Pennsylvania. I have a question about this generation of Chinese American ancestors. How the influence of Confucius, Asian values, family values, distinguished from Western values, individualism? And how about your review of Chinese American churches that you studied? How about the generations of generation, Confucianism, how's the feeling, hate and love, and the connection to home country? So big Chinese, your ethnicity, and like the Korean Americans, we are the first generation, second generation, we have families that connect with the home countries. But how about the generation?
Yeah, so if I could hear, I'm sort of poor hearing, but I understand like how much impact of Confucian culture, how much impact of homeland in my life. So I think, again, they're sort of taken for granted. I didn't realize how Confucian I am. And I actually, because I have some distance, Confucianism could be really painful. It's patriarchal. There's all the obligation and debt. And if you grew up in America, you want freedom and independence. There's all this authority and hierarchy. And then there is that sort of fake humility with that shame. So in the beginning, when I was younger, I resented a lot of that Confucian perspective. And then now as I'm older, it's like, I want to be respected because I'm older, I deserve it. It comes with age. But then I also want to, I appreciate humility. I appreciate reciprocity. I appreciate loyalty. Those love languages I named are actually Confucian values. And so it's, again, both and. You gotta distance yourself from the negative parts of Confucianism and integrate the good parts with your Christianity. And that's what I'm trying to do, actually, consciously. It's a lot easier when you do it consciously, because if you do it unconsciously, then you get the bad with the good. But if you do it consciously, you can discard the negative parts, the dysfunctional parts, the patriarchal parts, right? The oppressive parts. And then with the China stuff, I don't know, was that part of your question, how much we relate to China and homeland stuff? I'm pretty distant from China, and in some ways. Yeah, so the danger is that, again, as kids grow up in America, they become really individualistic. And American society is hyper individualistic because of capitalism, because of screens, everything's focused on you, right? All you get in your feeds are oriented towards you. You become the primary authority. And then who you relate to is shaped by your computer and the algorithms, right? And so even your social networks, even your sense of community is shaped by Twitter or Instagram or TikTok for young people. So it's very individualistic, and so they lose a lot of that sense of collective loyalty, that sense of thinking about the group first or thinking about others even, because capitalism really focuses on you as the authority, as the individual. So in sociology, we don't say there's real communities like the Korean church anymore. We just have networked individuals. And it's a whole different way of relating, and that's a whole talk for 3 hours.
Okay, thank you. If you see on the screen above, we have a QR code that links. So Dr. Jeung requested that that he gets some feedback, to help with future lectures and whatnot. So if you've never done this before, you just point your camera, open up the camera app, It should pop up into like a browser. If you don't feel comfortable with doing it online, we have physical hard copies. Pastor Seung will pass them out. If you want a hard copy, you can write your suggestions and we'll, give it all to Dr. Jeung, digitally. I think we'll give it at the very end. And so I think that's Dr. Jung's last, session for us. And so if you can give him a round of applause. Well, So just a quick announcement, change of schedule. And we know that 이재호 목사님 is heading to the airport pretty soon. So right now we're gonna actually take pictures together, all the group picture. I know COVID protocol, we're all wearing masks, but it'll be kind of weird if we